Welcome to the Roy Morgan Weekly Update. Well, last week was not a good week for the government. Consumer confidence was down 5.8 points to 90.7, and confidence in the government confidence was down 8 points to 84, both below that neutral 100. And the ALP increased its lead over the LNP. On a two-party preferred basis, ALP support was up 1% to 55.5, LNP support was down 1% to 44.5. So the ALP now leads the LNP by over 10 percentage points. If an election were held now, the ALP would win with a clear majority, according to the Roy Morgan poll conducted in the week up until Sunday, May 1, 2022. So what caused this loss of confidence? Well, all evidence points to inflation and the fear of interest rates increasing. Specifically, last week's higher than expected ABS CPI estimate of 5.1% for the year to March 2022, that was one shock, and now the prospect of the RBA increasing interest rates perhaps as soon as today for the first time in over 10 years. Now, this 5.1% is the highest inflation number for more than 20 years and came in higher than it was expected. And sometimes being higher than expected is worse than a number that we're expecting, regardless of the actual size. The inflation number that was generally expected was about 4.5%, still high, but 5.1 was way above that. So these inflation numbers and the increased prospect of increased interest rates really has clearly hit support for the LNP government. If we look now at the primary vote, the two major parties are now equal on 35% support after the LNP lost some primary support and the ALP remained unchanged in the last week. There's also a very high level of support for the other parties and independents, now at 30%, up 0.5 points in a week. And that's well up, much higher than the 2019 election, when around 25% didn't vote for one of the major parties. So last week we saw support for the Greens up 1 percentage point to 13. We saw support for independents up 1.5 to 9.5, and support for other parties down 2% to 7.5. And if we look in the longer term, we actually see the third week of this election campaign really ended the early momentum that the LNP had over the first 2 weeks. It really looked like it was closing the gap. But the rise in support for the ALP in the past week means the LNP is now more than 10 points behind, and that's likely far too much to make up in just 3 weeks. Perhaps the best result that the LNP can hope for at this stage is a hung parliament and an ALP minority government. Early voting, of course, starts next Monday, May 9, which means, of course, there's not that much time for anything to happen. Now we look at petrol prices, and we keep an eye on petrol prices almost as a litmus test of how people feel about inflation. It's a very public number. And we saw petrol prices increase 10 cents last week to $1.78 per litre, the second straight weekly increase. And as we've seen consistently, when petrol prices increase, consumer confidence tends to fall. And this week again, it did, down to 90.7. But of course, it isn't only petrol prices that have increased. We're actually seeing increases in prices across the board, from food to building materials. Looking now at this inflation data, the ABS CPI inflation has increased really rapidly from the lows of early in the pandemic 2 years. The latest figure of 5.1% for the year to March 2022 continues the upward trend since we experienced deflation in 2020. And the quarterly figure of 2.1% suggests if we multiplied it by 4, we'd have an annual rate of over 8% for the quarter. So this doesn't mean that we have 8%, but it definitely means that we can expect the annual figure to continue rising in the next quarter. So the ABS inflation has almost caught up to Roy Morgan's inflation expectation index. And that's the index that measures consumers' expectations. What do people expect inflation is going to be over the next couple of years? So later today, the RBA has to decide, or at least tell the rest of the nation, whether Australian interest rates are going to increase for the first time in over a decade. Now, the people watching the RBA most closely are no doubt that approximately 30% of the population with a mortgage, a key voting bloc in Sydney, Melbourne and other cities around Australia. These people do not want to see interest rates increase. And as we can see from this chart, the biggest plunge in consumer confidence in the past week, and it was a nearly 10-point plunge, was among those Australians paying off their mortgage. There were also declines among those people who already own their home and those people who were renting. But those declines were at less than half the rate of people who have a mortgage. So if the RBA does in fact increase interest rates today, it'll be a further shock for this large voting group that's a really key constituency in many marginal seats across Australia, and will spell further trouble for the LNP government trying to retain office. And as many of us know, the last time the RBA increased interest rates during an election campaign was 2007, the last time a Liberal National government lost office. Thank you all for listening, and I look forward to joining you next week.